For 20 years, my life was a carefully curated museum dedicated to one man, my husband, Marcus. I wasn't the curator. I was an exhibit, one of the less interesting ones, tucked away in a corner. My world was painted in shades of his ambition. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, not because I was a morning person, but because Marcus liked his coffee brewed for exactly 4 minutes and his newspaper ironed. Yes, ironed. He said it made the ink feel more permanent, more important. And I, his devoted wife, believed him. I believed everything. I managed his calendar, typed his manuscripts, and hosted the dinner parties that were the scaffolding of his academic career. I learned to distinguish between a Merlot that said, "I respect your intellect," and a Cabernet that screamed, "Please grant me tenure." My own dreams, the faint watercolors of a life I once imagined, had long since faded, bleached by the blinding sun of his potential. I had been an artist once. I loved the scent of turpentine and linseed oil, the feel of a loaded brush. But there was no room for the messy, unpredictable world of art in the sterile, ordered universe Marcus was building. He called my painting a charming hobby, a phrase that felt like a pat on the head to a child. So I packed away my canvases and dedicated myself to his. I became an expert in 14th century Italian literature, not because I loved it, but because he needed a proofreader who understood the nuances of Petrarchan sonnets at 3 a.m. My sacrifice was my art form. My love was the canvas, my days the medium, and his success the masterpiece I was helping to create. I genuinely believed that his triumphs were my own. I saw us as a team, a single entity striving toward a shared goal. I didn't see that I was just the foundation, essential but invisible, destined to be buried under the grand structure he was building for himself. The day it all fell apart was a Tuesday. It was the launch party for his third book, the one that was supposed to make him a household name in the insular world of historical academia. The air in the university hall was thick with the scent of old paper, cheap champagne, and intellectual vanity. I was wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically because Marcus said it made me look unobtrusive. My role for the evening was simple: smile, nod, and refill the glasses of anyone who looked important. I was a ghost at my own feast. He took the stage, bathed in a spotlight that seemed to physically push me further into the shadows. He was brilliant, of course. Charming, witty, profound. He thanked his publisher, his editor, his mentor, even the university librarian. He spoke of lonely nights spent wrestling with historical truths, of the solitary journey of the writer. He painted a portrait of a lone genius, and as I stood there, clutching a tray of half-empty glasses, I realized I wasn't in the picture at all. I didn't even exist. Later, when the applause had faded and the crowd had thinned, I found him near the exit, accepting congratulations from a young, bright-eyed graduate student. I waited. When she finally left, I touched his arm. "You didn't mention me, Marcus," I said, my voice small, a tiny crack in the marble facade of the evening. He turned to me, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. It was a look I'd seen him give to rival academics, a look of polite, dismissive evaluation. "Darling," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "This was about the work. It's a professional evening." I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. "But I'm part of the work," I whispered. 20 years, Marcus. I typed every draft. I organized every source." He sighed, a sound of profound weariness, as if I were a particularly dense student. "Ilara, don't be sentimental. It doesn't suit you." He then looked past me, toward the door, already moving on to his next victory. I stood my ground. "I'm not being sentimental. I'm asking for the truth." He finally looked at me, truly looked at me, and the mask of the charming intellectual fell away. What was left was cold, hard, and utterly indifferent. "All right," he said, his voice dropping to a low, clinical tone. "You want the truth? You were a comfortable chapter, a necessary one, I'll grant you. You managed the logistics, so I could create. But the story, the real story, was always mine. It was never ours." The words hung in the air, each one a perfectly crafted stone, and he used them to build a wall between us right there in that university hall. He didn't just break my heart. He erased my existence. He rendered 2 decades of my life into a footnote in his own biography. In that moment, my chow disappeared. It was the deepest pain I had ever felt. If you've ever gone through a great disappointment and understand what it's like to have your heart broken, please like this video so I know I'm not alone on this journey. The weeks that followed are a blur of gray. Marcus moved out, or rather, he had me moved out. The house we had built, the garden I had tended, the life I had curated. It was all his. I was an extraneous piece of furniture, easily discarded. I ended up in a small, damp apartment on the other side of town, a place that always smelled of boiled cabbage and regret. The silence was the worst part. For 20 years, my days had been filled with the rhythm of his needs, the clatter of his keyboard, the rustle of his papers, the sound of his voice dictating notes. Now, there was only the hum of the old refrigerator and the drip of a leaky faucet, a slow, steady erosion of my sanity. I would sit for hours on a lumpy sofa, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, trying to figure out who I was if I wasn't Mrs. Marcus Thorne. I had no answer. I was a ghost haunting a life that was no longer mine. I tried to find work, but my resume was a joke. Assistant to a historian, it read. Employers saw a 20-year gap where a career should have been. They saw a dilettante, a housewife with no marketable skills. The world Marcus and I had inhabited was a closed loop. Without him, I had no credentials, no connections, no value. The savings dwindled. I started skipping meals. Some days, the only thing that got me out of bed was the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. The emotional despair was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I was 40 years old, and I had nothing. I was a rough draft, crumpled up and thrown in the trash. The woman who once loved art, who dreamed of traveling, who had a laugh that people said sounded like wind chimes. She was gone. In her place was a hollow shell, filled with nothing but the echoes of another person's life. I hit rock bottom on a rainy Thursday in October, my 40th birthday. There was no cake, no cards, just the relentless drumming of rain against the window pane. I was sitting at my small, wobbly kitchen table, sorting through a box of old papers I'd managed to salvage from my old life, mostly sentimental junk Marcus hadn't wanted. Old photos, concert ticket stubs, dried flowers. Reminders of a life that felt like a fiction. And then I saw it. Tucked at the very bottom, beneath a stack of faded letters, was a single, solitary piece of mail. It was a postcard. It was old, the corner softened with time and travel, the stamp foreign and exotic. The picture on the front was of a field of impossible blue flowers, nestled in a valley between snow-capped mountains. I turned it over. The address was simply my name, Alara, sent to my parents' old house years ago, forwarded and re-forwarded until it had somehow found its way into this box of memories. And then I saw the message, written in a familiar, elegant, looping script that made my breath catch in my throat. It was just a few words. Where the wild lavender grows, the soul remembers its scent. G. And below it, the signature. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my Aunt Genevieve's. The same handwriting from every birthday card she'd ever sent me. Except that was impossible. My Aunt Genevieve, the wild, free-spirited botanist who smelled of earth and rain, had been declared dead in 2004, lost in a landslide while trekking in the Peruvian Andes. No body was ever recovered. For 16 years, she was a cherished memory, a tragic story, a ghost. But this postcard, this was not a ghost's handwriting. It was ink on paper. It was real. In the deepest, darkest moment of my life, a message had arrived from beyond the grave. It wasn't just a postcard, it was a spark, a tiny, fragile, impossible flicker of light in an endless darkness. That postcard became my obsession. I would take it out a dozen times a day, tracing the letters of her name, smelling the faint, papery scent of the card, trying to pull a memory from it. Where the wild lavender grows, the soul remembers its scent. It was the kind of cryptic, beautiful thing Genevieve would say. She didn't just see plants, she saw their stories, their spirits. She was a perfumer, not the commercial kind, but an alchemist. She believed that scent was the language of memory, the most direct path to the heart. And I remembered her small, sun-drenched workshop at the back of her garden, a place that smelled of damp earth, drying herbs, and 1,000 secret flowers. I remembered the rows of glass bottles, the brass scales, the thick, leather-bound book where she wrote down her formulas in that same elegant script. Her grimoire, she called it. A new, frantic energy took hold of me. I tore through the remaining boxes from my old life, the ones I'd barely had the heart to open. And there it was, in a dusty crate labeled sentimental, tucked between my old art supplies and my mother's wedding dress, the grimoire. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was all there. Page after page of her beautiful handwriting, detailing the properties of oils, the distillation of flowers, the art of blending. There were pressed flowers between the pages, their colors faded, but their forms still perfect. It wasn't just a recipe book. It was her soul on paper. I had nothing to lose. I took the last of my savings and bought a cheap distillation kit online. I foraged for herbs in the local park, rosemary, mint, the meager city lavender that grew in dusty patches by the road. My tiny apartment kitchen became my laboratory. The first attempts were disastrous. I burned the rosemary, creating a thick, acrid smoke that sent my neighbors into a panic. I distilled a batch of rose petals that ended up smelling like boiled cabbage, a cruel reminder of my surroundings. It was frustrating, exhausting work. I failed again and again. But for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Marcus. I wasn't marinating in my own misery. I was working. I was trying. I was covered in dirt and steam and the pungent smell of failure, but I felt more alive than I had in years. The breakthrough came late one night. I was trying to recreate a scent she described in the book, a blend meant to evoke the feeling of a coming storm. It involved vetiver for the damp earth, a touch of ozone, and a top note of petrichor, the scent of rain on dry ground. I worked for hours, my fingers stained, my back aching. And then it happened. A single drop on my wrist. I closed my eyes, and I wasn't in my grim little apartment anymore. I was 7 years old, standing on my aunt's porch, watching dark clouds gather in the summer sky, the air electric with anticipation. It was perfect. I wept. Not tears of sorrow, but of release. I had found it. Not just a scent, but a connection. A piece of my past, a piece of her, a piece of myself. My first real victory wasn't about money. It was about a woman named Mrs. Gable. She was a quiet, elderly woman who lived down the hall, always dressed in morning black though her husband had passed 5 years prior. I saw the deep, unabiding grief in her eyes. It was a look I recognized. One day, I gathered my courage and knocked on her door, holding a small, unlabeled bottle. "This is for you," I stammered. "It's just a little something I'm working on." She looked at the bottle, then at me, her eyes filled with skepticism. But she took it. The next day, she knocked on my door. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but for the first time, they weren't empty. "How did you do it?" she whispered, clutching the bottle like a holy relic. It smells like his study. The leather chair, the pipe tobacco, even the lemon drops he always kept in the drawer. She told me she had sat with the scent all night and, for the first time since he died, she remembered him with a smile, not just with pain. She had remembered their life, not just his death. In that moment, I understood what Genevieve had been doing. This wasn't about making perfume. It was about bottling memory. It was about giving people back a piece of what they had lost. Mrs. Gable insisted on paying me, and she told her friends. Slowly, word began to spread. I started a small, online business from my kitchen table, calling it the Apothecary of Memory. I didn't offer a menu of scents. Instead, I asked my clients for stories. They would write me long, emotional letters about a person, a place, a moment they yearned to revisit. A lost love, a childhood home, a perfect summer afternoon. And I would become a detective of the soul, using Genevieve's grimoire and my own growing intuition to translate their words into scent. The work was all-consuming, but it was my salvation. I was re-engaging with the world, not as Marcus Thorne's wife, but as myself. The ghost was finally getting her substance back. The tipping point came when a popular lifestyle blogger wrote a piece about me. She called me the Scent Whisperer. The article went viral. Suddenly, my inbox was flooded with hundreds, then thousands of requests from all over the world. The demand was overwhelming. I moved out of the cabbage-scented apartment and into a small workshop with a storefront. It was terrifying and exhilarating. I hired my first employee. I was no longer just surviving. I was building something. Something that was entirely mine. It was there, with my hands deep in a bowl of crushed jasmine petals and sandalwood, that I realized the profound truth of my journey. I had spent 20 years helping a man archive the past, treating history as a collection of dead facts and footnotes. But now I was doing something different. I was making the past live again. I was giving it breath and warmth and allowing it to heal the present. It was there, with my own hands, that I began to rewrite my story. I stopped being the victim and became the author of my own destiny. If my journey of overcoming is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and be part of this community of new beginnings. Life found a new rhythm, one dictated by the seasons of flowers, not an academic calendar. My shop became a sanctuary, a quiet place in a loud world. The bell above the door would chime, and in would walk a new story, a new heart in need of remembering. I learned the scent of a father's wool coat, a grandmother's kitchen, the salty air of a first kiss on a distant beach. My life was filled with the intimate histories of strangers, and in healing a small part of their past, I was mending my own. I never heard from Marcus. For 3 years, he was as silent and absent as if he'd never existed. I assumed he was stewing in his own importance in some ivy-covered corner of the world. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, the bell chimed. And there he was. He looked smaller, less monumental than the statue I held in my memory. The suit was still expensive, but it seemed to wear him, not the other way around. He looked around my shop, a faint, condescending smile on his lips, the same one he'd given my paintings all those years ago. "Elara," he said, his voice trying for a warmth it didn't possess. "Quite the charming little enterprise you have here. Who knew you had such a knack for business?" I didn't feel the old sting of fear or inadequacy. I just felt a strange, detached pity. I continued to grind a piece of amber resin in my mortar, the sweet, warm scent filling the air. "Hello, Marcus. What do you want?" His smile tightened. He wasn't used to my directness. "I heard about your success. The article, the buzz. It's impressive. You've managed to monetize nostalgia. Very clever." He walked closer, picking up a small bottle and examining it like a curious artifact. "I have a proposition for you. I'm curating a major exhibition on the sensory experiences of the Renaissance. Imagine it. We could create a line of historic scents based on my research. The perfume of the Borgias. The scent of a Medici library. We could brand it, franchise it. With my name and your craft, it could be huge." There it was. The same old story. His name, his work, his glory. I was to be the craftsman again, the silent partner, the logistics manager for his grand vision. He saw my soul, my art, my entire world, and his first instinct was to monetize and brand it. He hadn't changed at all, but I had. I stopped grinding the resin and looked him straight in the eye. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. "No," I said. It was a simple word, but it felt like the heaviest, most solid thing I had ever built. He blinked, thrown off balance. "No?" "Elara, don't be foolish. This is a real opportunity, a chance to elevate this hobby into something significant." And that was the word that sealed his fate in my world forever. "Hobby. This isn't a hobby, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. "This is my life. It was born from something you could never understand. It was born from loss and memory and a truth you can't footnote in one of your books." I gestured around the shop, at the rows of amber bottles, each one holding a story, a universe of emotion. "You deal in facts. You collect and catalog the past. You put it under glass. I bring it back to life. What I do here is sacred. It's the one thing in my life that you will not touch, you will not brand, and you will not elevate. I have no interest in your proposition." He stared at me, his face a mixture of shock and wounded pride. The charming academic was gone, replaced by a petulant man who had just been denied something he wanted. "You'll regret this," he sputtered. "You're choosing this little shop over a real legacy." I gave him a small, genuine smile. "You still don't get it," I said softly. "This is my legacy." I turned back to my mortar and pestle, the message clear. The conversation was over. He stood there for another moment, adrift in a world he couldn't conquer, then turned and walked out. The bell chimed his departure, and a profound sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't revenge. It was a closing of a door, a final, quiet reclamation of my own story. I never did find out for sure about Aunt Genevieve. I think the postcard wasn't an invitation to find her, but an invitation to find myself. She gave me a map, not to her location, but to my own soul. She knew I had the grimoire, and she knew that one day I might need the language within it to remember who I was. My peace is here, in the scent of sandalwood and rose, in the tears of a stranger who has just been reunited with a memory they thought was lost forever. My legacy is in these little bottles of grace. Today, I understand that the wounds of the past don't define who we are, but what we do with them does. I took my broken pieces and, with the help of a ghost, I built a new life, one that is fragrant with purpose and peace. I thank you so much for listening to my story all the way to the end. If it touched you, share it with someone who needs a light and leave a comment with a word of strength and hope. Together, we are stronger.